Has COVID switched up the picture for travel? For decades, the trend was job creation around cities that pushed the commuting class onto trains in ever greater numbers. And now, even as work starts on Europe's biggest rail project, the outlook seems almost the inverse of what it once was. Rail travel had almost doubled since the privatisation of the industry in the mid-90s, and that growth was forecast to continue. Network Rail were planning on passenger numbers increasing again by 40% by 2040. That was part of the rationale for HS2, officially costed at up to £88 billion.
I've got absolutely no doubt that mass transit transport infrastructure is going to be crucial for our country, not just now, but in the decades ahead.
But now there is a new backdrop. Rail travel remains under a third of its pre-COVID levels, and there is a question over whether a lasting shift towards home and more flexible working could change where we live, work and commute. The original economic case for HS2 largely focused on user benefits like faster journeys, reliability, less waiting and less crowding. Those may be lower if railways face a quieter future. Other benefits included agglomeration effects, the idea that better connectivity, in this case between cities, boosts productivity.
Euston Station, it seems.
This member of the panel that reviewed HS2 before its approval this year thinks the cost-benefit analysis will now have shifted.
I think the case undoubtedly is weakened by the fact that there are fewer people travelling. Now, we don't know whether the reduction in rail travel is permanent or whether it will all get back in 3, 4, 5 years' time. And I think, interestingly, that COVID-19 and the need to recover the economy as a result of it has sort of slightly tilted the balance in favour of this as a grand reinvestment, get the economy going project, rather than as a railway, because we don't know what railway demand's going to be like 10, 15, 20 years out.
Oxford Economics in 2018 estimated that every £1 of activity on the railway network supported £2.20 of income in associated industries and suppliers. And today's launch came with the promise of 22,000 jobs. The immediate economic impact of the construction work going on around here may be appealing, but fundamentally this is a very long-term project. The second stage to Leeds and Manchester is crucial to arguments in its favour and may not be completed until 2040. But it also seems hard to make a judgment about what impact COVID might have on a railway that's designed to last for centuries. Some supporters of the project also argue that focusing solely on commuting or journeys to and from London misses the point. Building a new high-speed line should free up capacity on the existing network, capacity that's needed to respond to whatever the future might bring.
I think the problems that we had pre-COVID were so gross in terms of overcrowding, that even if commuting does reduce, there will still be a need to provide more capacity. If you have capacity, you can choose how to use it. If you haven't got capacity, you can't. And at the moment, our existing railway really only does one thing particularly well on the West Coast Main Line, and that's very limited stop, long distance trains. Those are the trains that will use HS2. And that gives you the choice of whether to use the existing railway for local services, long-distance commuters, more freight, or whatever.
Our existing rail routes aren't used now in the way envisaged when they were built in the 19th century. And it may be years before we know whether the COVID effect is another fleeting controversy or a lasting change that reverses what we expected from HS2.
Helen Thomas will joining me now, Rachel Skinner, the Senior Vice President of the Institute of Civil Engineers, Baroness Jenny Jones, a former Deputy Mayor of London who represents the Green Party in the House of Lords, and Adrian Quine from the Adam Smith Institute, who's also Director of Rail Chartered Services Limited. Good evening to all of you. First of all, Rachel Skinner, just putting to you what Tony Travers said in the film there, and he was on the review phase of HS2's in the review panel. He said the economic case is weaker than 6 months ago. It's impossible to know if travel will return. It's really an economic stimulus package. Is that right in your view?
So I think there's no doubt that obviously the last 5-6 months have seen enormous change. I think in terms of our short-term infrastructure priorities, beyond High Speed 2, we need to accelerate our programmes around things to do with digital connectivity, fibre and 5G, but also to do with active travel, cycling, walking and so on, to make sure that we're catering for the here and the now. But that's to do with accelerating what's already planned rather than stopping other investment priorities such as High Speed 2 and so on. So in the longer run, when we think about the real long-term drivers and how we need to really think about the actual challenges we're trying to solve, it goes way beyond the transport scheme. It is all to do with the fact that we are, as a country, going to have to deal with more people. Our population is going to grow to around about 75 million under current projections. We will need more homes. We will need more infrastructure in the right places to support all of that. It's also to do with carbon. We have a legally binding net zero carbon emissions target to achieve by 2050. And while that may still seem a really long way away, these are major projects that need to eat into that target. So while COVID might be the crisis of right now, climate change and carbon is very much the looming crisis of the decade and the century. And the third piece, and we heard a bit about it just now, is to do with levelling up. We have entrenched regional inequalities around the country. It's not just about north-south, it's not just about urban-rural, it's our lived experience that can really vary massively between neighbours who are just a few streets apart.
Well, just dealing with HS2 for a moment, Jenny Jones, I mean, it is a ready-made plan. It delivers both a green railway and an economic stimulus. So it's two wins.
Well, I'd better say, first of all, that Greens love railways. My partner works on the railways. We go on holiday by railway all the time. But this is not your usual railway. HS2 is actually a super-fast railway which can't go round corners. And so it's cut a swathe through our countryside, destroying environment, destroying SSSIs. And I think it's going to be a disaster. And Ms Skinner mentioned levelling up. If you were going to level up, you would not put in a railway from Birmingham to London. You would actually put it from, say, Birmingham to Leeds or farther north.
Of course, that is eventually what is going to happen in the next, by 2040.
Of course, but you wouldn't start with this phase. You would actually start somewhere else.
But what about the argument that once you put in that line for HS2, what you do is you free up the other existing lines, and that will take, for example, freight, which means it takes it off the road, which reduces carbon emissions, which again is a green policy.
But if you're spending that much money, what you can do is spend it in other places and actually better schemes. And plus, from a carbon neutral point of view, it won't be carbon neutral for over a century. So it is not any sort of green solution.
Adrian Quine, is this any way to design policy when the project itself is not as important as the economic stimulus it delivers? You may as well build a pyramid.
Yes, I mean, I think the biggest problem actually we have with HS2 isn't the fact that HS2 isn't needed. I mean, there's no question we do need more rail capacity. The biggest problem is that it's too gold-plated. It's over the top, and it doesn't actually solve the very things that most rail passengers need. Only 7% of passengers in the UK travel long distance. The vast majority travel over commuter routes.
But we know,
so
but just to come in on you there, as we very well know, things may change. People may make longer journeys less often than make daily commutes.
This is true, but you can still deliver an awful lot more on the existing rail net with things such as digital signalling, with longer trains, with better use, segregation of the tracks between freight trains, etc., and by infilling with certain pinch points rather than investing in this sort of rather too long vanity project, which is actually designed, these very, very high-speed trains are designed for routes like Paris to Bordeaux, where you have very long distances. The other point, which nobody really picks up on, is that most high-speed routes tend to be point to point. They tend not to stop. Every time you stop somewhere, it negates the reason to go very, very high speed. So if we're going to have a high-speed route from London to Birmingham that stops from London to Manchester or Leeds that stops at various places, it slightly defeats the object. So you're far better actually investing in smaller scale schemes that are going to deliver real benefits for where people want.
Well, you just say you've got £100 billion. We're talking about a levelling up agenda. where then, Adrian Quine, would it be better spent?
I think you have to look at where the pinch points are, and the pinch points are not between London and Birmingham. The pinch points are actually in the north of England. So it's poor commuters who live in the satellite towns and commute into Liverpool, Sheffield, Leeds, Manchester every day that end up with a grotty service that takes forever. And actually, if you look at the average speeds on those sort of smaller feeder lines, as opposed to the average speeds on the West Coast or East Coast main lines, there's a massive difference. So that is where the investment needs to go in. Now, I know people will say, but we're going to build Transport for the North, we're going to build HS3, but all the focus is on HS2, which is going to take so long and is not going to deliver those short-term benefits.
But if we're looking, Rachel Skinner, at what people will actually need, the way their lives are going to change post-COVID, just 3 examples. Barclays, having thousands of office workers in one building may be a thing of the past. Aviva, office capacity of 10% is expected for the foreseeable future. Twitter, a mandatory work-from-home policy, including in its London office. How does that play in with this idea of point-to-point railways?
So in the grand scheme of things, there isn't one size fits all as a solution here. This isn't about either or picking one thing over another thing and abandoning other plans. Obviously, during lockdown, some people have been lucky enough to be able to work remotely throughout. And some of those examples you just gave there are of the sorts of businesses where that is entirely possible in terms of professional services and similar. But this, of course, has relied really heavily on that core digital connectivity. And that's likely to continue for a while as we all settle into new ways of working. But we need to remember there's an awful lot of people out there who can't work in that way. They need to be in a particular place at a particular time in order to actually undertake their job. So, for example, people in healthcare, manufacturing, construction, hospitality, and so on. And an awful lot of those people simply don't have the options that we're talking about here if we don't have the necessary infrastructure. I don't think it's necessarily just about the big ticket infrastructure, though. I think one of the really big tricks that perhaps we could play on a bit as we come out of COVID is to think much more about the local connectivity and how you get people hooked into some of the bigger infrastructure networks that already exist for transport so that people can participate more fully in terms of where they want to go, what they want to be doing and so on. And at the moment, that is often very, very difficult.
Jenny Jones, how do you reimagine how life will be post-COVID when we are actually only thinking short term about how things are going to change? We know you heard those statistics from 3 big businesses, but that is only what they're thinking in the next 2 or 3 years. And the whole point about this is built to last. These infrastructure projects are built to last. Surely we should be doing it now when we need to stimulate the economy.
I think there's other things where we should be investing the money that are actually more for the future than HS2. For example, we should be investing in insulating every single house in Britain. That would reduce fuel bills and reduce the need for fuel as well. We should be making sure that everybody has super fast broadband so that everybody can work from home. People have discovered a new way of living and they're living more locally, and I think people are enjoying it. It's good for them, but it's also good for the community, and it's much better for the environment if people live locally. And as well, of course, all the travel plans that Ms Skinner mentioned, we should be making sure people can walk. There is a concept called 15-minute cities, and Melbourne, Ottawa, Detroit and Paris have explored this. And it means that everything you need is within 15 minutes walk, and that changes people's lives immensely.
That whole idea of some radical reimagining of how we work, Adrian Quine, surely that is the way ahead. That kind of blue sky thinking for the Conservative Party. It's extraordinary to think of a Conservative Party operating in a way backwards, thinking about the economic stimulus rather than actually what it provides. Would you imagine Margaret Thatcher doing this, for example?
Well, I don't think it should be an all one thing or the other. I think there's a need, obviously, for some new blue sky thinking urban planning, and I think some of the ideas that Jenny outlines are good. But I think we also need to invest in rail, because rail does produce some huge social and economic benefits. I think the biggest problem, though, going back to HS2, is that it's the wrong priority. It doesn't actually deliver what most people want. Yes, there's an issue with capacity, but there are other ways of sorting that capacity out. about. And post-COVID, we're in a very different world. The other point here is, remember, HS2 was originally sold to us as about speed. That argument then changed to capacity. Now the argument seems to be it's about British supporting the British construction industry. So the argument seems to change the whole time. We've actually lost sight of what it was all about in the first place. I think we need to actually start from scratch and look at where the priorities are. And I don't think the current proposal for £100 billion plus high-speed rail network on a relatively short distance, linking major cities, is really what people want. Nurses don't commute between London and Birmingham or London and Leeds. They commute from the outlying cities, outlying centres into the city centres. That's what we need to focus on.
Thank you all very much indeed.